Hello, everyone. I am here today again with James Rosewell, co founder of Movement for an Open Web, and also a keynote speaker at Ad Monsters Ops, taking place June 3rd and 4th in New York City. As many of you may know, James works very closely with the Competition and Markets Authority, CMA. And today we're going to talk about the CMA's latest report, which includes their updated perspective on issues identified in their report from January. So, James, how are you today?
Yeah, very good. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Well, yeah, good afternoon. Actually, it's noon now. So, can you summarize for us today the recent CMA report and what it entails?
Well, I think at a high level, it's really a tipping point. The 26th of April report is a tipping point as far as the digital industry, not just advertising and publishing, is concerned, but in its entirety. Because this isn't the first time we've seen the CMA and the ICO come together and present their opinion. They reference many material from 2021, for example, their joint statement. We'll come on to that in a minute. And we now have both the competition and the privacy view of the world, and we can see the tension that's acknowledged in the report between these considerations. So we have a triangle consisting of the ICO, the CMA, and Google. And the ICO and the CMA are very unlikely to change their position. They have certain charters and mandates and all this kind of stuff. So really the question will be what Google do next, recognizing that the design of Privacy Sandbox isn't going to satisfy these two issues. So they're in tension with each other. And that's really what we've got to look at over the next 3 months.
Sounds good. So, me being an American, hearing about the ICO was new for me. So, the ICO is the Information Commissioner's Office. And the report, as we talked about, expressed the first time that they've been involved. So, what is the ICO?
So the Information Commissioner's Office were involved back in the commitments, so they're actually named in the commitments. So what we have, the commitments is the voluntary agreement that Google entered into with the CMA in February 2022, and the ICO are the part of the UK government's the wrong word. The regulation landscape in the UK that deals with personal data and privacy, and the CMA deal with competition on the other hand. So whilst they're part of the same jurisdiction and the same group of regulators, they have different mandates. So the CMA can't talk about privacy because it's not in their mandate, and likewise the Information Commissioner's Office is not concerned with competition. It's purely concerned with privacy and data. So when the commitments were entered into, the CMA are the body that rule and make decisions on competition, and the ICO do the same on privacy.
Do you think that the ICO's involvement changes the dynamic of the investigation, or probably not, since they have different responsibilities?
Well, just to again just being a bit of a pedant, there isn't an ongoing investigation. So the investigation that led to the commitments is paused. If the commitments come to an end, could be time expired, it's February 2028, or non-compliance happens, then the investigation would restart. But I think the ICO's involvement is absolutely crucial for the industry. What we're learning is that Google have not really complied with the ICO guidelines with Privacy Sandbox. So I just want to pause for just a few seconds. Google have not complied with the ICO guidelines. So this is one of the largest companies in the world that have managed to get the privacy position of Privacy Sandbox wrong as far as the ICO is concerned. And we see in great detail, more detail than we've ever seen before, from a competent data protection regulator where there's deficiencies. So, for example, we see APIs where effectively the output of the privacy API is still personal data. So the implication being that if you use that data, there's some sort of joint controller relationship in place between Google and the caller of the API. That's only just starting to surface, but that would be an implication of what's been provided. So we'd certainly want to see in the July report more clarity around that from the ICO. I'm sure Google are screaming for it, from the ICO, and the rest of the industry would want to know that. But what we also see in the report is lots of references back to past documents. I mentioned the 2021 publications. So one in particular really outlined the CMA and the ICO's joint statement at the time, and the report of the 26th of April is simply saying, that still applies, nothing's really changed. So you read that report and it's very clear. I'm just going to read you an extract from it now. Box B of the May 2021 report. There is no explicit reference to the distinction between first-party and third-party data in data protection law. And the report, particularly the Annex 2 of the report, really goes into some detail around the position on that. So what I hope happens is the industry where there's a thought that first party somehow is okay and third party is bad. Yeah, that really isn't the right way of thinking. Thinking about these things. So what we see now in the report is, I mentioned the tension between the ICO, the CMA, and Google, but we're also starting to see the tension between interoperability, privacy, and competition. So what's happening is the degradation in interoperability that's coming about because of the threat to remove third-party cookies is driving some participants in the industry to collect data that would be considered first-party data, but might actually represent a higher privacy risk than random identifiers that have been tagged as third-party. So there's a lot to unpack there. And then if we introduce some other material from the ICO, so I'll put some of these links in the various comments, depending on what platform we're following up with this on. But we've got their anonymization guidance. Now, this is still in draft because the UK government post-Brexit are going through a revision of data protection law. So the ICO decided they'd wait for the elected government to make any changes before they continued with the work. But actually, the drafts are pretty good. So when they talk about anonymization, we can take part of UK GDPR. So information which does not relate to an identified or identifiable natural person or to personal data rendered anonymous in such a manner that the data subject is not or no longer identifiable. Okay, so this is talking about anonymous information, which isn't actually necessarily a defined term. And then they go on to say, as anonymous information is therefore no longer personal data, the principles of data protection law do not apply when you process it. In the ICO's view, the same information can be personal data to one organization, but anonymous information in the hands of another. So again, they're referring back to their past guidance, of which I've quoted that just because it's the most convenient. So what we're actually starting to see now is that the solutions to these problems, and I think we can talk about governance in a minute, actually can't be solved just by engineering. Yeah, we need to look at other things. And in fact, the report starts to point to classification of information. So the third-party cookie in itself, as Annex 2 shows us, technology is neutral, but some technology is easier to comply with guidance than others. But the third-party cookie in itself isn't actually a problem. It's how it's been used by certain actors. So it starts to point to remedies when we start considering all this information coming out of the report. And indeed, just on this point, to bring Apple into it, and what I really love is then their privacy policy, where they say your reading and listening activity in news and stocks is linked to an identifier specific to news and stocks and is not associated with your Apple ID or linked to your other Apple services. So that certainly shows an organization that's able to use random identifiers that are anonymous under certain situations in order to present the selection of stocks and news in this particular case in a way where they comply with the data protection law by making sure it's anonymous information. So if Apple can do that, why should Google be allowed to restrict other people from being able to do, other parties in this ecosystem from being able to do the same thing? It's just not justifiable. So I'm sorry that's a bit long, but hopefully it gives you the interrelationship between some of these things in the report.
No, definitely. I was trying to take notes because this is tricky stuff. Definitely a lot of information. But one thing I do remember about the report when I was going through it is there was about over 79 areas of concern identified, including issues like latency and governance, which you mentioned earlier. But what areas of the report or what concerns do you consider to be the most crucial?
Well, there are certain things like I'll just pick on the two that you've described. I'll do them in reverse order. So governance is basically saying that you can't just do certain things and have computers do it all. You need to have a way of making decisions, and that has to be fair. And Google haven't presented, solutions to that, and setting up new governance organizations or changing existing ones is not something that happens particularly quickly. So that needs to be done, and that's good because we're starting to see almost certainly with governance there'd be an aspect of law and an aspect of economics coming in to ensure that it's fair governance rather than partial governance, which is skewed to a particular position. So that's good. When it comes to the technology side of things, great to see latency there. But the reality is every engineer knows that the browser is limited. It's running on a relatively small piece of hardware that you don't control as a business that's using it. It's sitting in someone's pocket a lot of the time. It's connecting to a radio network that can be variable together with lots of other devices that are on there. The performance just can't be guaranteed. So even if browser engineers do the very best job they can't provide the kind of assurances around performance that can be achieved with server to server. So will Google do as Microsoft have done and move some of the functionality server side and allow multiple organizations to implement that functionality? That would be another significant change. So I think, in Google's response, this isn't just continue as we are. We'll just keep making some tweaks here and there and it's going to be okay. It's a case of going back to the drawing board. And I think when you consider the IAB Tech Labs assessment around whether this is actually ready, this technology is ready, just the approach that's been taken to engineering solutions for hundreds of billion dollar business is just shocking. So I think it's good that Google will need to go and rethink, and hopefully a more robust approach to the engineering will follow.
But when you speak of going back to the drawing board, like if Google does that, do you think they're going to be able to do it by the start of 2025? Figure
No,
everything out? No.
no,
Okay,
no,
me
no. And what happens in that time period is we've got the Digital Markets Act. So it was only 8 or 9 weeks ago that core platform services under the European Commission's Digital Market Acts were designated. So that's Chrome, Safari, iOS, and Android. So I think we're going to see an awful lot more from the European Commission now that they've got the tools and power to take action. We've got the web browser inquiry in the UK as well, which is basically control over the gateway, as well as that I mentioned with the DMA. So a lot's going to happen in the next 6 months. And we will see. Certainly for sure it's going to be interesting for another year to come. Of course, this is my opportunity to say what Movement for an Open Web are aiming to do is bring regulation to the market. That's what we're working for, so that the excitement associated with changes to interoperability from gatekeepers becomes entries on Wikipedia and past articles in various events and media magazines. And we can get on with the job of innovating without continually either worried about the rug being pulled out from under our feet or trying to second guess what the gatekeeper is going to do.
Yeah. So just considering everything that's happening, what are the implications for smaller players in the market if, everything goes as planned with Privacy Sandbox?
Well, there are smaller players in different sectors. So if we start with publishers, their route to monetization is going to be a lot harder. There's a lot of talk about first-party data, as I said at the beginning of this chat. I think that really needs to be rethought in relation to the guidance that I mentioned. But they're just not able to collect that kind of directly identifiable personal data that larger more well-established brands would be able to. Despite the fact they might have a more privacy compliant solution, their ability to monetize is what matters, and that will make it very difficult. What do those organizations then do? Well, maybe move into the walled gardens, monetize through that platform. And I think that would be a real shame. The web won't be able to fulfill its potential, and actually will be degraded as a result. For smaller advertisers, they're already being coerced into the Facebooks, Metas, and Googles of this world. And of course, Apple, we now know, are absolutely in the advertising game, where they've got a revenue share with Google of 40%, I think, in recent disclosure. Apple are absolutely in the advertising game, and have many reasons to stay as things are. I think that would be a problem. It would make an existing problem even worse. So harder for advertisers, and of course, suppliers, particularly suppliers who are trying to bring innovation to the market for both advertisers and publishers, that their options, because of the degradation and interoperability, are diminished. So that again causes issues. So I'm more hopeful than I've ever been that Privacy Sandbox in its current form won't happen, for the reasons that we mentioned earlier. And I hope what can happen is we'll now start to have a proper dialogue about solutions that genuinely improve privacy. I've mentioned some of the guidelines earlier around anonymization, not getting hung up on first and third, this kind of stuff, all written in the ICO or CMA documentation and guidelines. And we can start to have a proper conversation about improving privacy, and actually improving competition as well. I think it's entirely achievable, and the report of the 26 points in that direction.
Yes, genuinely improving privacy, not just, as they say, putting a Band-Aid on it. Okay, so I'm going to move on. I know that Mao advocates for an open and competitive approach to changes in how the web operates. How do you see this playing out in real terms? And what alternatives would you propose?
So the dialogue should now move to remedies. We were just saying genuine remedies. I'm not going to, sit here and say, I've got the answer, and if you do these 3 things that James and Movement for an Open Web say, everything's going to be perfect in the world, and we can all, finish and that'll be it, all rosy. I think there's got to be not only a genuine improvement to privacy, but to get there, we need to have a genuine and honest dialogue. So for example, the interplay between interoperability, privacy, and competition is now starting to come out in that report. So if we if we continue to conflate these 3 things and then turn them into one thing with one sort of bogeyman effectively, then we're not going to make progress. So let me just give you an example of that. We have some publishers who will say that there has been a market failure because intermediaries take more money than they should. The equivalent of the real estate agents all getting together and effectively charging more than is justifiable, which means if you have to sell your house, you've got to pay a fee that isn't reasonable. And then you've got no choice over the use of those intermediaries or the business practices of those intermediaries. So that's a market failure falling under the banner of competition, effectively. So some of the participants in the market would say, well, okay, the degradation in interoperability that enables some of those bad things to happen is a good thing. Therefore, we'll support the degradation with interoperability, without understanding, and then say, and it makes things more private. So we'll bring that in as well. So we can say, we're on the side of the angels with privacy. So I think that's really bad. The interoperability, in this case, the ability to transfer data between 2 data controllers lawfully, there's nothing wrong with it. The ICO guidance I've pointed to, and these aren't just selected extracts, this is the general gist of what's going on, is perfectly okay. So the interoperability can remain. The market failure can be identified as as a market failure. When it comes to privacy, where we've got genuine privacy issues, they can also be addressed as well. And we can start to then think about, well, what are the characteristics of a solution that addresses those things? And again, in the report, this is why I think the 26th of April report is so important. We start to see the clues as to what that might look like. So if data can be labeled, then we could start to see solutions coming forward where, from a privacy perspective and interoperability perspective, then the interoperability can be retained. The privacy can be dealt with by labeling the data. Is it personal data, or is it, as I read from the ICO statement, anonymized data, therefore isn't personal data anymore? And therefore it might be treated differently. The data that's personal data, there might be some information about how the data was created or captured, and that might be transmitted along with the data, so that computers that are acting on the user's behalf can then make informed decisions about how to transfer that data, what lawful basis is it being transmitted under, etc. So then when we start to see that, we can start to unpack the competition issues, the issues around, as I say, intermediaries. So we start to have, I think, the foundation of a narrative and a debate about improvement that's not only potentially simpler to achieve, but is more honest.
Awesome. So with all that being said, what are the next steps for Move? How do you plan to continue to influence the debate and everything that's happening?
So we're the lead complainant to the CMA. So we got together in September 2020. We wrote to the CMA. We asked them to use their interim measures powers to prevent Google from degrading interoperability. Sadly, the CMA didn't do quite as we asked. They did the next best thing, which is the commitments that we talked about earlier, and they still have the option to go back to the investigation, and they still have those powers available if they feel they need to use them. I'm wondering, given the report and the complexity, whether they're regretting not having done what we'd originally asked for. But you'd have to ask them that. So we continue to engage. We want to move the discussion with the regulators and with the industry to one where we're talking about remedies now. I think as I say, the clues, the signs are in that report around what that might look like. I've just described how we can unpack the three competing concerns and what the sort of characteristics of a solution might start to look like. That will need to combine, say, engineering, law, economics. We're not going to find the answer just in the discipline of engineering alone. I think that'll be a good thing. We'll continue to do the same with the European Commission. So we made the original set of complaints effectively to the various different regulators. It wasn't just the CMA. The CMA is just the one that's been most vocal. So we'll continue to work with them and put our view together. We continue to encourage anyone watching this, anyone in the market, to come forward with regulation. If I can, I guess I could. There's two things that I would ask and suggest. One I've already mentioned, which is the guidelines. Really read those items. They take 2 or 3 hours for any professional business person to read and understand. It's well worth reading. Very well written, the ICO documents. But also, regulation only works if the market engages with the regulator. Yeah. Now, I think there's quite a few organizations, certainly when I set this up, people looked at me, a little bit strangely, like, regulation doesn't work. It takes 10 years and then they find someone and all the victims have basically gone out of business. You can't, have a strategy or solution around that. And, whilst I respect that view, I hope everyone would say, well, regulation is having an impact. You may not like it, but it is certainly having an impact, and there's more regulation coming. So we'll continue to encourage people to engage with and businesses to engage with the regulator, because a regulated market is coming, and it's not exactly revolutionary. Where, depending on when you say this started, whether it was 25 or 30 years ago, many decades in, and this is an essential resource that underpins society. So regulation will happen and be part of the implementation of that regulation. is very much our message.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. We all just ate regulation for lunch. Um, did you have anything else that you wanted to add today, or?
I think just really to summarize, I think there's a lot of, we haven't talked about the delay, particularly. You haven't really asked me questions about that, and I kind of respect that. I think, there was one question on that. I think it's easy to get hung up and say, well, Google are the monopolist, they've delayed things again, three delays, roll your eyes, whatever. I just think that there's information there that's easy to obtain, and I'd encourage reading of that, understanding that material, particularly the ICO, those ICO guidelines. There's a lot more that we'll be talking about in June. We're going through a little bit of the background on some of this stuff, and I'm really looking forward to meeting with everyone in person, and discussing this, and maybe over a coffee, over a beer, those remedy discussions that we just started to touch on, and which the ICO and the CMA are pointing towards, we can start to build on them. That's very exciting.
Very exciting. And yes, I did not ask you too much about the delay because I didn't want to go too much into what you will be talking about at Ops. So didn't want to spoil too much, but thank you so much, James. And for those of you who do not know, James is one of our keynote speakers at AdMonsters Ops. So if you would like to continue this discussion with him in person, make sure you are there. I also want to let you all know that we have 4 keynotes locked in, 4 amazing speakers. So please make sure you get your ticket to Ops. And for watching today, you get $100 off your ticket by using the promo code JR Live. So thank you so much, James, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you. Enjoy your afternoon.
You too.